Hey there, tonight we're settling in for a journey back through time to medieval England. We're going to explore something that sounds almost unimaginable in our modern world of thermostats and central heating. We're going to discover how people in the Middle Ages managed to sleep through the coldest winters without any of the comforts we take for granted today. No heating systems, no electric blankets, no insulated walls, just timber, thatch, and human ingenuity. So take a moment to get comfortable in your warm bed, maybe adjust your pillow, and let's ease into this fascinating chapter of history together. Before you drift off tonight, think about how you'll sleep. You'll probably adjust your thermostat, maybe turn on a space heater, or pull up an extra blanket. Now imagine a world where none of those options existed, where winter arrived with a cold that seeped through walls, crept across floors, and settled into bones. That was the reality for people living in medieval England, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest noble. Their winters were long, dark, and relentlessly cold. Yet they survived, they adapted, and they found ways to rest through it all. Tonight, we're going to understand how they did it. Introduction: the medieval English winter. Medieval England stretched across several centuries, roughly from the 5th century through the 15th century. During this vast span of time, the climate itself underwent changes that would profoundly affect how people lived and slept. The period wasn't a single, unchanging era, but rather a collection of different climatic phases, each with its own challenges and characteristics. From around the year 900 through 1300, parts of Europe, including England, experienced what researchers now call the medieval warm period. This wasn't a time of tropical heat or endless summer. Rather, it was a phase when temperatures were somewhat milder than they had been before, and somewhat warmer than what would come after. During these centuries, England enjoyed relatively stable weather patterns. Harvests were generally more reliable. Vineyards could be cultivated at latitudes where they would later become impossible. The growing season extended just a bit longer. Winters, while still cold, were perhaps slightly less harsh than in earlier or later periods. But even during this warmer phase, winter remained a serious challenge. England is an island nation, surrounded by water that brings moisture and wind. The winters were damp, the kind of cold that settles into your bones more than dry cold ever could. The dampness meant that even temperatures just above freezing could feel bitterly uncomfortable. And when temperatures did drop below freezing, which they often did, the combination of cold and moisture created conditions that were genuinely difficult to endure. By the early 1400s, the climate was beginning to shift again. The medieval warm period was giving way to what would eventually be recognized as the Little Ice Age, which would last roughly from 1300 through 1850. During this transitional period and the centuries that followed, winters became noticeably colder. Glaciers advanced in mountainous regions across Europe. Rivers froze more frequently. The growing season shortened. Famines became more common as crops failed in the colder, wetter conditions. For the people living through this transition, the change would have been gradual but unmistakable. Each generation might have noticed that winters seemed a bit harsher than their grandparents remembered. Temperature records from this period are sparse and imprecise. Medieval people didn't have thermometers or systematic weather recording. What we know comes from indirect evidence: mentions in chronicles of particularly harsh winters, records of when rivers froze, notes about failed harvests, observations about when certain crops could or couldn't be grown. These scattered clues have been pieced together by climate historians to create a picture of what medieval winters were actually like. Estimates suggest that during the colder phases of the medieval period, winter temperatures in England could drop significantly below what we experience in most modern winters. The coldest months, typically December through February, would see average temperatures hovering around freezing or below. But averages don't tell the whole story. Cold snaps could bring temperatures well below freezing for extended periods. Snow was common, though perhaps not as constant as we might imagine. The real challenge wasn't necessarily extreme cold in the way we might think of Arctic winters. It was the persistent, penetrating cold combined with dampness, with wind, with the impossibility of ever getting truly warm except for brief moments near a fire. The nights were long. In midwinter, darkness would fall in the middle of the afternoon and last until well into the morning. With no electric lights, no street lamps, no glowing screens, this darkness was complete and absolute. The cold and the dark went together, creating winters that felt like they might never end. And through it all, people had to find ways to keep working, keep living, and most importantly for our purposes tonight, keep sleeping. When we think about how medieval people survived these winters, we need to understand that they approached the problem very differently than we do today. We tend to think of heating as something that warms an entire space. We heat rooms, we heat buildings, we create warm environments. Medieval people couldn't do this, at least not effectively. Instead, they focused on staying warm themselves. They layered clothing, they stayed active, they huddled together, and when it came time to sleep, they employed every strategy they could devise to make it through the night. The experience of winter varied tremendously depending on social status. A wealthy lord in a stone castle faced different challenges than a merchant in a timber-framed townhouse, and both were far better off than a peasant family in a one-room cottage. But cold is democratic in a way. It affects everyone. Even kings shivered. Even nobles woke to see their breath misting in the air. The difference was in the resources available to fight the cold, not in whether the cold existed. As we explore how people slept during these winters, we'll be looking at the period roughly from 1100 through 1500, with particular attention to the 13th through 15th centuries, when documentation becomes more detailed. We'll be focusing primarily on England, though many of the strategies and solutions would have been similar throughout Northern Europe. We'll examine the physical structures people lived in, the heating methods they used, the bedding they slept under, and the daily routines they followed to make winter nights bearable. The geography and climate of medieval England. To understand how people slept through medieval winters, we first need to understand the specific challenges presented by England's geography and climate. England's position as an island in the North Atlantic creates a unique climate situation. The surrounding sea's moderate temperatures, preventing the extreme cold found in continental Europe at similar latitudes, but they also ensure high humidity and frequent precipitation. This means that English winters, even during the medieval warm period, were characterized more by damp cold than by dry, bitter cold. Medieval England was a land of varied terrain. In the south and east, rolling hills and relatively flat plains dominated the landscape. These areas were more heavily settled and farmed. The western and northern regions were hillier and more mountainous, with poorer soil and harsher conditions. Throughout the country, dense forests covered much of the land, far more than exists today. These forests provided crucial resources: timber for building, wood for fuel, and shelter from wind. Rivers cut through the landscape, providing transportation routes and water power for mills, but also creating valleys where cold air could settle and fog could linger. The climate during different phases of the medieval period showed significant variation. Research based on historical records, tree rings, ice cores, and other proxy data gives us a picture of these changes. From roughly 900 to 1300, the medieval warm period brought relatively mild conditions to much of Europe. In England, This meant longer growing seasons and more reliable harvests. Contemporary records mention vineyards being successfully maintained in regions where they couldn't survive in later centuries. The period wasn't uniformly warm throughout, and different regions experienced the warming at different times. But overall, these centuries were characterized by climatic conditions that favored agriculture and population growth. Temperature estimates for this period suggest that central England might have experienced average temperatures that were perhaps half a degree to 1 degree Celsius warmer than the long-term medieval average. This might not sound like much, but in agricultural terms, it could mean the difference between a successful harvest and a failed one, between enough food stored for winter and widespread hunger. For our purposes, it meant winters that, while still cold, were perhaps slightly less brutal than what came before or after. The transition away from the medieval warm period began gradually around 1300. The climate became more variable, with more frequent extreme weather events. Severe storms became more common, growing seasons shortened, summers became cooler and wetter, and winters became colder. This transition period saw some of the worst famines of the medieval era. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, caused by excessive rain and cold temperatures, killed millions across Europe. Crop failures led to widespread starvation, and the weakened population became more vulnerable to disease. By the mid-1400s, England was entering what would become recognized as the Little Ice Age. Glaciers advanced in alpine regions. In England, winters became noticeably colder. The Thames River in London froze more frequently, with frost fairs held on the ice becoming a recurring feature of London winters in later centuries. While the coldest phases of the Little Ice Age would come in the 16th and 17th centuries, the trends were already evident in the late medieval period. Winter weather in medieval England was unpredictable and could be harsh. Snow fell regularly, though perhaps not as heavily or constantly as in continental regions at similar latitudes. Ice formed on puddles, ponds, and sometimes rivers. Wind was a constant presence, especially in exposed areas, and the combination of wind and dampness created a penetrating cold that was difficult to escape. Frost could damage buildings, making thatch brittle and causing timbers to contract and crack. The damp cold could trigger respiratory ailments, joint pain, and various illnesses. The seasons had a different rhythm than we experience today. Winter wasn't just December through February. The cold season could stretch from October through April, with only the depths of summer offering truly warm weather. Spring came late, with cold snaps still possible well into April or even May. This meant that the period during which heating and warm sleeping arrangements were necessary extended across much of the year. Medieval people observed their environment closely because their survival depended on it. They noted the signs of coming weather, the behavior of animals, the appearance of the sky, the feel of the wind. They couldn't predict with accuracy, but they developed a practical understanding of seasonal patterns. They knew when to expect the first hard frost, when rivers were likely to freeze, when the worst cold typically arrived. This knowledge informed when they slaughtered animals for winter meat, when they brought livestock indoors, when they gathered the last fuel for their fires, and when they prepared their sleeping arrangements for the coldest months. The length of winter nights was another challenge. In southern England at the winter solstice, the sun rises around 8 in the morning and sets around 4 in the afternoon, providing only about 8 hours of daylight. In northern England and Scotland, the day is even shorter. This meant long hours of darkness, and darkness in medieval times was profound. Without artificial light beyond candles or firelight, Nights were truly dark in a way modern people rarely experience. The combination of long, dark, cold nights created an environment where sleep was both necessary and challenging. Understanding this climate context is essential for understanding medieval sleeping practices. The cold wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was a months-long reality that shaped every aspect of daily life. And at night, when activity decreased and fires were banked, when darkness was complete and temperatures dropped further, staying warm enough to sleep required careful preparation and every available resource. Medieval housing, construction, and insulation. The houses medieval people lived in were both their first line of defense against winter cold and, in many ways, their greatest vulnerability. Unlike modern buildings with their insulation, weather-tight construction, and multiple heating zones, medieval structures were simple, drafty, and offered limited protection against the elements. Understanding medieval housing is crucial to understanding how people managed to sleep through cold winters. The vast majority of medieval English people were peasants or small farmers, and their homes reflected their limited resources. The typical peasant house in the 13th through 15th centuries was a modest structure, often consisting of just one or two rooms. These houses were built using a construction method called timber framing. Vertical wooden posts created the basic structure, with horizontal beams connecting them. The space between these timbers needed to be filled in to create walls, and this is where the technique known as wattle and daub came into play. Wattle and daub was an ancient building method that had been used for thousands of years. The wattle was created by weaving thin, flexible branches, typically hazel or willow, between the vertical timber posts. These woven branches created a lattice, like a large, rough basket stretched between the structural timbers. Once the wattle was in place, the daub was applied. Daub was a mixture of clay, mud, sand, animal dung, and chopped straw. This mixture was worked by hand or by treading, often by livestock walking through it, until it reached the right consistency. The daub was then pressed onto the wattle from both sides, working it through the gaps in the lattice so it formed a single cohesive mass. Skilled workers could build up the daub to create a relatively smooth surface, typically several inches thick. Once the daub dried, it hardened into a reasonably solid wall. The dried daub would then be coated with lime plaster on both the interior and exterior surfaces. This plaster served multiple purposes. It protected the daub from rain, created a smoother surface, and provided some additional weather resistance. The problem with wattle and daub construction, at least from a modern perspective, is that it provided very little insulation. The walls were porous. Air could move through gaps between the timbers and the infill, especially as the daub dried and cracked over time. Rain could penetrate if the exterior plaster wasn't maintained, and the thinness of the walls meant that cold could conduct through relatively easily. A wattle and daub wall might be only 4 to 6 inches thick in total, compared to modern insulated walls that can be 10 inches or more. The roof was another critical element. Most peasant houses had thatched roofs made from bundles of straw, reeds, or sometimes heather. Thatch, when properly installed and maintained, is actually a reasonably effective roofing material. A thick layer of thatch, properly laid, can shed rain and provide some insulation. The air trapped within the bundled straw creates tiny pockets that slow heat transfer. However, thatch had significant limitations. It needed to be replaced or repaired regularly, typically every 20 to 30 years, and this was expensive in terms of both materials and labor. Thatched roofs were also highly flammable, a constant source of anxiety in medieval communities. More importantly for our purposes, thatched roofs were far from airtight. Smoke from the central hearth had to escape somehow, and in many medieval houses, especially smaller ones, there was no proper chimney. The smoke simply rose into the roof space and eventually found its way out through gaps in the thatch. This meant that heat from the fire also escaped readily. Cold air could enter through the same gaps. During windy weather, drafts could whistle through the thatch, and in heavy rain, water could sometimes penetrate, especially if the thatch was old or poorly maintained. The floors of medieval peasant houses were typically made of compacted earth or clay. This was simply the ground beaten hard by feet and sometimes mixed with clay to create a more solid surface. Such floors were cold, especially in winter when the ground itself was frozen or very cold. Some slightly wealthier peasants might have wooden floorboards, at least in part of their house, but this was relatively uncommon except in the late medieval period. Earth floors were dusty in dry weather and muddy when wet. They offered no insulation from the cold ground below, and in winter, the cold would radiate up from the floor constantly. Windows in peasant houses were small and few, primarily because glass was expensive and beyond the means of most people. Most windows were simply shuttered openings. In warm weather, these shutters would be open to let in light and air. In cold weather, they would be closed, blocking some of the drafts but also blocking all natural light. Some houses might have oiled parchment or oiled cloth stretched across window openings, which would allow some light through while blocking some of the wind, but this was still relatively porous. The overall result was a structure that provided shelter from rain and some protection from wind, but offered very little in the way of insulation or heat retention. Heat from a fire would warm the immediate vicinity of the fire, but it would escape rapidly through the walls, roof, and floor. At night, when the fire burned low or was banked, temperatures inside a peasant house might not be much warmer than temperatures outside, especially if it was windy. Wealthier peasants, successful craftspeople, and members of the emerging middle class might have somewhat better houses. These might be larger, with 2 or 3 rooms instead of 1. They might have wooden floors, at least in the main living area. The timber frame might be more substantial, and the infill materials might include brick in some areas, though this was still relatively rare in the medieval period. Some might have a separate kitchen building to reduce fire risk. But even these improved houses still relied on wattle and daub or similar construction methods, and they still offered limited insulation by modern standards. Moving up the social scale, the houses of wealthy merchants, minor nobility, and the gentry were more substantial. These might be hall houses, structures with a large central hall open to the roof, with private chambers at one or both ends. The hall would have a central hearth, while the private chambers might have their own fireplaces built into the walls, especially by the 14th and 15th centuries when chimney technology was becoming more common and more sophisticated. These larger houses often used stone foundations and ground floors, at least for the main structure. Stone provided better protection against damp rising from the ground, and stone floors could be covered with rushes or reed mats to provide some insulation from the cold. The upper floors of these houses were typically timber framed with wattle and daub infill, similar to peasant houses, but often better constructed and maintained. One feature that became increasingly common in larger houses was the use of tapestries, wall hangings, and wood paneling on interior walls. These served multiple purposes. They were decorative, displaying wealth and taste. But they also provided a crucial practical benefit. They created an air gap between the cold exterior wall and the interior space. This air gap provided some insulation, reducing the direct transmission of cold from outside. Tapestries and hangings could be quite elaborate in wealthy households, depicting biblical scenes, hunting scenes, or heraldic designs. but even simpler cloth hangings in more modest, wealthy homes served the same insulating function. At the top of the social hierarchy, nobles and royalty lived in castles or manor houses built primarily of stone. Stone construction had advantages and disadvantages when it came to winter comfort. Stone walls were thick, often several feet thick, and when properly built, they were largely impervious to wind and rain. They were also extremely durable and fire-resistant. However, stone is an excellent conductor of heat, or more accurately, an excellent conductor of cold. In winter, stone walls would become extremely cold, and they would radiate that cold into interior spaces. Without insulation in the modern sense, stone buildings could be bitterly cold inside, despite their thick walls. Large stone buildings also tended to be drafty. Perfect airtightness is difficult to achieve even with modern construction methods, and medieval builders had neither the materials nor the techniques to create truly draft-proof structures. Doors were substantial but rarely perfectly fitted. Windows, even when closed with shutters or early glass, allowed air infiltration. The sheer volume of interior space in castles meant that heating them to anything approaching comfortable temperatures was nearly impossible. To combat this, castle builders incorporated various features. Walls might be plastered on the interior, which helped somewhat. Tapestries were hung extensively, and the grandest castles had truly spectacular tapestry collections. Private chambers in castles often featured wooden paneling, which created an additional barrier against the cold stone. By the later medieval period, some castles had glass windows in the most important rooms, typically small panes held together with lead strips. While primitive by modern standards, these did provide better protection against drafts than shuttered openings. One feature found in some wealthier buildings was the construction of smaller rooms within larger spaces. A castle might have a great hall for public functions, but the lord's private chamber would be a much smaller room, often built within a tower or in a separate wing. Smaller rooms were easier to heat than large ones, and they could be made more comfortable through hangings, braziers, and other heating methods we'll explore later. The principle was simple: reduce the volume of air that needed to be warmed. Regardless of social class, certain features were common to all medieval buildings. Doors were often covered with heavy curtains in winter, helping to block drafts when the door was closed and preventing heat loss when it needed to be opened. Beds, as we'll discuss in detail later, often had curtains around them, creating a smaller, more easily warmed space within the cold room. Rooms were often subdivided with temporary or permanent partitions, again to reduce the volume that needed to be kept warm. Another common feature, especially by the later medieval period, was the practice of keeping the upper floors of buildings warmer than the lower floors. Heat rises, so upper floor rooms received some benefit from heat generated on lower floors. More importantly, upper floors were usually smaller and had less exposed surface area relative to their volume, making them somewhat easier to keep warm. In houses with 2 stories, families might sleep upstairs in winter, taking advantage of this slightly warmer environment. Despite all these adaptations and variations, the fundamental reality remained. Medieval buildings, from peasant cottages to royal castles, were cold in winter. They were cold in a way that's difficult for us to truly understand, accustomed as we are to centrally heated homes. Every medieval person would have understood intimately what it felt like to wake up to see your breath misting in the bedroom air, to dress in a room cold enough that you could see frost on the interior of shuttered windows, to go to bed knowing that you'd feel cold sometime during the night no matter how many blankets you piled on. This was the physical reality that shaped medieval sleeping practices. The house wasn't warm. It couldn't be made warm, at least not throughout. So sleeping successfully through a medieval winter required other strategies, other adaptations, other solutions. The house provided shelter, but warmth had to come from other sources. Heating methods, the central hearth and beyond. When darkness fell on a medieval winter evening and the cold began to deepen, the focus of household life shifted to the fire. Fire was the only real source of heat available, and managing that fire effectively was crucial not just for cooking and warmth during waking hours, but also for maintaining some warmth through the long night ahead. Understanding medieval heating methods is essential to understanding how people managed to sleep through cold winters. The central hearth was the heart of most medieval homes, literally and figuratively. In the simplest peasant houses and in the great halls of manor houses and castles, the hearth was typically positioned in the center of the main room. This central location served several purposes. First, it allowed heat to radiate in all directions, warming the space as evenly as possible. Second, it was safer than positioning the fire against a wooden wall. And third, it provided a natural gathering point where family members and household servants could cluster for warmth. The hearth itself was often just a raised platform of stone or clay, built up from the floor to prevent the fire from spreading to the surrounding earth or wood. The fire burned directly on this platform, with no grate or firebox in the early medieval period. Wood was laid on the hearth and lit, and as it burned, more wood was added. The smoke rose from the fire, and in houses without chimneys, simply ascended to the roof space where it eventually found its way out through gaps in the thatch or through a dedicated smoke hole. This arrangement had obvious disadvantages. The room would be smoky, especially when the fire was first lit or when wind conditions prevented smoke from escaping efficiently. Everything in the house would gradually become coated with soot. Respiratory problems were common. But people adapted to these conditions because there was no alternative. The fire provided essential warmth and the means to cook food, and these benefits outweighed the discomfort of smoke. The type of fuel used varied depending on what was available locally and what people could afford. Wood was the primary fuel for most people. England was still heavily forested during the medieval period, and wood was relatively accessible, though it became increasingly regulated and expensive as time went on. Forests were often owned by the nobility or the crown, and peasants might have limited rights to gather fallen wood or coppice timber, but were prohibited from cutting down living trees without permission. Different types of wood burned differently. Hardwoods like oak, ash, and beech burned slowly and hot, providing steady, long-lasting heat. These were prized for overnight fires. Softwoods like pine burned faster and produced more smoke but were easier to ignite, making them useful for getting a fire started. Wood needed to be properly seasoned, meaning dried for at least a year after cutting. Green wood was difficult to burn, produced excessive smoke, and provided less heat. Well-managed households would have wood supplies laid in months or even years in advance, stored under cover to keep it dry. In areas where wood was scarce or expensive, other fuels were used. Peat, which is partially decomposed plant matter cut from bogs, was common in areas where it occurred naturally. Peat burns slowly and provides steady heat, though it produces a distinctive smell and significant smoke. In some coastal areas, people burned dried seaweed. In regions with coal deposits, coal began to be used as fuel during the later medieval period, though this was still relatively uncommon in most of England before the 16th century. Whatever the fuel, managing the fire required constant attention. During the day, the fire needed to be tended, with fuel added regularly to maintain heat for warmth and cooking. As evening approached and the household prepared for sleep, the fire required different management. The goal was to keep some heat through the night without the risk of the fire spreading and without wasting precious fuel. The technique for banking a fire overnight was well understood. In the evening, after the last meal was cooked and before everyone retired, the fire would be carefully arranged. The burning logs would be pushed together into a compact pile. Any unburned wood would be removed and set aside for the next day. Then the glowing embers and coals would be raked together and covered with a layer of ash. This layer of ash would be thick enough to reduce the oxygen supply to the coals, causing them to burn very slowly, but not so thick as to completely smother them. This banked fire would smolder through the night, producing a small amount of heat and remaining alive in the form of glowing coals buried under the ash. In the morning, the ash would be carefully raked aside, exposing the coals, which could then be blown gently with bellows to bring them back to flames. New kindling and fuel would be added, and the fire would be built back up to full strength. This method saved the labor of starting a fire from scratch each morning, which in the medieval period was a significant effort involving flint and steel or the preservation of coals from a neighbor's fire. The heat provided by a banked fire overnight was minimal, but not entirely negligible. The covered coals and surrounding hearthstones would remain warm for hours, radiating a small amount of heat into the room. This wasn't enough to keep the room comfortable by modern standards, but it did keep the temperature from dropping quite as low as it would have with no fire at all. And in the morning, having living coals to restart the fire meant that warmth could be restored relatively quickly. The introduction of the chimney revolutionized medieval heating, though the change happened gradually over several centuries. The earliest chimneys in England appeared in the 12th century, primarily in castles and the homes of the wealthy. By the 13th century, chimneys were becoming more common in substantial houses, and by the 15th century, even some peasant houses might have a simple chimney, though many still relied on the central hearth. A chimney solved the smoke problem by providing a dedicated path for smoke to escape. Instead of smoke filling the room and eventually finding its way out through the roof, it was drawn directly up the chimney and out of the house. This made the interior much more comfortable and reduced the soot buildup. Early chimneys were often fairly simple structures, essentially vertical shafts built into or against a wall, lined with stone or brick. More sophisticated chimneys had features like smoke chambers that helped improve draft and firebacks that reflected heat into the room. With the addition of a chimney, the fireplace could be moved from the center of the room to the wall. This had both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was that it freed up the center of the room for other uses. The disadvantage was that heat now radiated primarily in one direction, into the room, rather than in all directions. This meant that parts of the room far from the fireplace would receive little benefit from the fire, but the reduction in smoke was considered worth this trade-off. Fireplaces with chimneys also allowed for more control over the fire. Dampers could be partially closed to regulate draw. Andirons and grates could be used to position logs for better burning, and fireplace openings could be designed to direct heat more efficiently into the room. By the late medieval period, wealthy households had fireplaces in multiple rooms, allowing different parts of the house to be heated independently. A lord's private chamber might have its own fireplace, kept burning through the night to provide some warmth for sleeping. However, even with fireplaces and chimneys, heating an entire room to what we would consider comfortable temperatures was difficult and expensive. The amount of fuel required to keep a room continuously warm through a winter night was substantial, and fuel costs were significant even for wealthy households. More commonly, Fires in bedchambers would be lit in the evening to take the chill off the room, then allowed to die down to coals overnight. The residual warmth from the fireplace stones and the banked coals would provide some ongoing heat, but the room would still cool significantly by morning. For heating bedrooms, some households used portable heating devices. The most common of these was the brazier, a metal bowl or basin on a stand that could be filled with hot coals from the main hearth and carried to another room. Braziers had been used since ancient times and remained popular throughout the medieval period. They could provide localized heat in a bedroom or other space, and they had the advantage of being portable and requiring no permanent installation. However, braziers were also dangerous. The risk of fire was constant. A brazier could be knocked over, spilling hot coals onto wooden floors or straw. The heat from a brazier could ignite nearby fabrics or furnishings, and braziers produced carbon monoxide, which in a poorly ventilated room could be deadly. Despite these dangers, braziers continued to be used because they were one of the few ways to bring warmth to a room that didn't have its own fireplace. Another method for providing warmth in bed was the bed warmer. This was a long-handled pan with a lid, similar to a covered frying pan. Hot coals would be placed in the pan, which would then be run between the bedsheets shortly before someone climbed into bed. The heat from the coals would warm the sheets and remove some of the damp chill. Bed warmers didn't provide warmth through the night, but they made getting into bed more bearable. They were more common in wealthy households, where servants could prepare beds this way, but simpler versions existed in less wealthy homes as well. Hot stones were another method for providing warmth in bed. Smooth stones, typically river rocks, would be heated in the fire until they were very hot, then wrapped in cloth to prevent burns. These hot stones could be placed in the bed, often near the feet, where they would retain heat for several hours. This was a practice that didn't require any special equipment, just stones and cloth, so it was accessible to people at all economic levels. Multiple stones could be used, and as the night progressed and one set of stones cooled, they might be replaced with a fresh set if someone was willing to get up and tend the fire. Some wealthy households, particularly castles and large manor houses, experimented with more elaborate heating solutions. We have records of a few medieval buildings that had heated floors, inspired by Roman hypocaust systems. These were rare and expensive, involving hollow spaces under floors where warm air from fires could circulate. Such systems required substantial construction work and ongoing maintenance, so they were limited to the wealthiest establishments, and even then were not common. For most people, through most of the medieval period, heating meant a fire in the main living space, and perhaps a fire in one or two other rooms if the household was wealthy enough. Overnight, fires were banked or allowed to burn low. Bedrooms, for those who had separate sleeping rooms, were generally unheated except perhaps for brief warming before bed. The result was that going to bed meant leaving the relative warmth of the main living area, where people had been sitting near the fire, and entering a cold sleeping space where the only warmth would come from blankets, body heat, and whatever residual heat remained in the room. The fuel economy of heating was a constant consideration. Wood, peat, or coal all required money or labor to acquire. Peasants might spend significant time gathering fuel, while wealthy households had servants dedicated to this task and might purchase fuel from professional woodcutters or charcoal burners. The amount of fuel needed to heat even a modest house through a winter was substantial. Estimates suggest that a peasant household might need several cords of wood to get through winter, while a manor house or castle might require dozens of cords or more. This meant that fires couldn't be maintained at full strength all the time. Fuel had to be conserved. During the day, when people were active and could generate body heat through movement, fires might burn lower. In the evening, they would be built up for cooking and warmth during the coldest hours. And overnight, they would be carefully managed to preserve coals for morning while minimizing fuel consumption. Every piece of wood was valuable, and wasting fuel was seen as both economically foolish and potentially dangerous, as running out of fuel before spring could be life-threatening. The management of fire was a crucial household skill, typically taught from childhood. Children learned to build fires, tend them, bank them for the night, and restart them in the morning. They learned which woods burned best, how to identify good firewood, how to stack wood for proper drying. They learned the dangers of fire and how to prevent accidents. This knowledge was essential for survival, and everyone in a household needed to understand at least the basics. As we've seen, medieval heating methods were fundamentally different from modern heating. There was no way to warm an entire house to a comfortable temperature and maintain that temperature through the night. Instead, heat was localized, temporary, and required constant attention. This reality shaped how people slept. They couldn't rely on a warm room. They had to rely on other methods to stay warm through the cold night, methods that centered on the bed itself and what was in it. Bedding, textiles, and sleeping arrangements. If medieval houses couldn't be kept warm overnight, and fires provided only limited heat, then the bed itself became the primary means of staying warm while sleeping. Medieval beds and bedding were not just furniture and accessories. They were essential survival equipment, carefully constructed and maintained to provide maximum warmth and comfort in cold conditions. Understanding medieval bedding helps us understand how people actually survived the winter nights. Let's start with the bed frame itself, because not everyone had one. The poorest peasants often slept directly on the floor on what was essentially a pile of straw or hay. This straw might be covered with a coarse cloth or piece of old fabric, but often it was simply loose straw spread on the ground. The straw would be gathered into a heap where people would sleep, and in the morning, it might be pushed aside or left in place. Fresh straw would be added periodically as the old straw broke down, became damp, or became infested with insects. Sleeping on straw directly on a cold earthen floor was obviously uncomfortable and cold. The floor itself, as we discussed, would be quite cold in winter, and the thin layer of straw provided minimal insulation. People sleeping this way would need to wear most of their clothing huddled together with family members and pile on whatever additional covering was available. This was survival sleeping, with no pretense of comfort. A step up from sleeping on loose straw was the straw mattress. This was essentially straw or hay packed into a large sack made from coarse cloth, often called ticking. The fabric was typically rough linen or hemp cloth, woven loosely enough that the straw inside could compress and shift, but tightly enough to contain it. These mattresses would be laid on the floor or, if the household was slightly better off, on a low wooden platform or simple bed frame. Straw mattresses had several problems. First, straw breaks down over time, becoming dust and chaff. This meant the mattress would gradually become flatter and less supportive, and it would need to be refilled regularly, typically at least once a year and often more frequently. Second, straw attracted pests. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and various other insects found straw mattresses to be ideal habitat. Mice and rats would sometimes nest in them. No amount of shaking or airing could completely eliminate these pests, so everyone who slept on a straw mattress simply accepted that they would share their bed with various creatures. Third, straw mattresses offered limited insulation from below. The straw would compress under body weight, reducing its insulating properties. And if the mattress was directly on the floor, cold would still radiate up from the ground through the compressed straw. Still, a straw mattress was better than loose straw, and for most peasants, this was the standard sleeping arrangement throughout the medieval period. For those who could afford something better, there were alternatives to pure straw. Hay, which is dried grass rather than grain stalks, was sometimes used and was considered somewhat better than straw. Hay was softer and less likely to have sharp, pokey ends. Some people mixed straw and hay, getting some of the advantages of each. In some regions, other plant materials might be used: dried heather, bracken fern, dried moss, or even dried leaves. These materials all had different properties, but they all shared the basic function of providing a layer between the sleeper and the cold ground. Feather mattresses represented a significant step up in both comfort and warmth. These were fabric bags, usually made of finer linen than straw mattresses, filled with feathers and down from geese, ducks, or chickens. Feathers are excellent insulators, trapping air between their filaments and creating a barrier against cold. A feather mattress would be softer, warmer, and more comfortable than a straw mattress in every way. However, feather mattresses were expensive. Feathers had to be collected over time, typically when birds were butchered for food. A single mattress might require feathers from dozens of birds. The ticking needed to be made from relatively tightly woven fabric to prevent feathers from poking through, and such fabric was more expensive than coarse cloth. For these reasons, feather mattresses were generally found only in the homes of the wealthy, the emerging middle class, or in churches and monasteries where communal resources could support them. Wool mattresses were another option, sitting somewhere between straw and feathers in terms of cost and quality. These were filled with raw wool or wool waste from textile production. Wool is also an excellent insulator, and a wool-filled mattress would be considerably warmer than straw. Wool mattresses were less common than either straw or feather mattresses, but they were found in the homes of prosperous farmers, craftspeople, and lower-ranking clergy. Regardless of what the mattress was filled with, it would typically be laid on some kind of bed frame, at least in households that could afford one. The simplest bed frames were just wooden platforms raised a foot or two off the ground, 4 posts at the corners, with boards or ropes stretched between them to support the mattress. This elevation served several purposes. It lifted sleepers away from the coldest air, which settled at ground level. It provided storage space underneath the bed, and it made getting in and out of bed easier, particularly for older people or those with joint problems. More elaborate bed frames found in wealthier households were constructed like small pieces of furniture. They might have a headboard and footboard, carved and decorated. The sleeping surface might be supported by a lattice of ropes threaded through holes in the frame, creating a slightly springy surface that was more comfortable than hard boards. These ropes needed to be tightened periodically as they stretched with use, giving rise to the phrase "sleep tight," which originally referred to tightening the bed ropes. The most elaborate beds were the great beds found in castles and manor houses. These were substantial pieces of furniture, often large enough to sleep 4 or more people. They had carved wooden frames, sometimes painted or gilded. But the most important feature of these beds, from our perspective, was the bed curtains. Most substantial medieval beds, from the 14th century onward, were enclosed by fabric curtains hanging from a wooden frame or canopy attached to or above the bed. These bed curtains served multiple crucial functions. First, they provided privacy. In households where many people might sleep in one room, curtains created a private space within the shared room. Second, they blocked drafts. Medieval rooms were drafty, and the curtains created a relatively still air space around the bed. Third, and most importantly for winter sleeping, they created a smaller volume of air that could be warmed by body heat. The principle is simple. A medieval bedroom might contain hundreds or thousands of cubic feet of air, all of which would be cold. A person's body generates heat, but that heat dissipates into the surrounding air. If the surrounding air volume is very large, the person's body heat will have negligible effect on the overall temperature. But if the air space is reduced, body heat becomes significant. Inside a curtained bed, the volume of air might be only a few dozen cubic feet. Two or more people sleeping together would generate enough heat to noticeably warm this smaller space within an hour or so. Bed curtains were made from various materials depending on the wealth of the household. In the grandest beds, curtains might be heavy wool, velvet, or even tapestry-like woven fabric. These thick, heavy fabrics provided excellent insulation and blocked drafts effectively. In more modest, wealthy households, curtains might be wool or heavy linen. Some beds might have multiple layers of curtains, with a heavier outer curtain and lighter inner curtains. The curtains could be opened during the day to air the bed and closed at night to conserve warmth. Once in bed, whether on straw or feathers, whether on the floor or in a curtained bed, the next line of defense against cold was the bedding itself. Medieval people used layering, piling covers on top of each other to trap air and insulate the body. The exact arrangement varied, but a common setup would include several layers. Directly on top of the mattress might be a sheet, if the household was wealthy enough to have sheets. Sheets were lengths of linen fabric, and linen was expensive enough that many peasant households didn't have sheets at all, sleeping directly on the mattress covering. For those who had sheets, the bottom sheet would be laid on the mattress, and people would lie on top of this sheet. A top sheet might cover them, though this was less common in the medieval period than it would become later. On top of the sheet or mattress, multiple blankets would be piled. Medieval blankets were typically made from wool. Wool is one of nature's best insulating materials. The fibers trap air in tiny pockets, creating a barrier against cold. Wool also has the remarkable property of retaining some insulating ability even when damp, which was important in the damp English climate. A wool blanket could absorb moisture from the air or from body perspiration without completely losing its warmth. Blankets varied in quality. The best were made from fine wool, woven into a tight, even fabric that was warm, durable, and relatively soft. Cheaper blankets might be coarser, scratchier, and less densely woven, but they still provided warmth. A peasant household might have 1 or 2 blankets. A wealthy household might pile 6 or 8 or even more blankets on a bed in winter. The top layer of bedding was often a coverlet or counterpane. This was a heavier covering, sometimes quilted, that served as the final barrier against cold. Coverlets in wealthy households could be quite decorative, made from fine fabrics and embroidered or woven with patterns. But their primary function was practical, to hold in warmth and keep out cold. Some coverlets were lined with fur, which provided exceptional insulation. Rabbit, cat, squirrel, or sheepskin might be used, sewn into or onto the coverlet. Furs were also used as separate bed coverings. A fur throw or fur-lined covering would be placed on top of the other bedding. Fur is extraordinarily warm, and even a single fur covering could make a significant difference in comfort. However, furs were expensive, so they were found primarily in the beds of the wealthy. Even nobles might have only 1 or 2 fur coverings, used in the coldest weather. Pillows were not as common as we might expect. Many medieval people slept with their heads resting directly on the mattress or on a simple bolster, which was a long cylindrical cushion running the width of the bed. When pillows were used, they were typically filled with feathers or wool, similar to mattresses. Straw pillows existed but were quite uncomfortable. The pillow would be covered with linen if the household could afford it. An important aspect of medieval bedding was the use of night clothes. People did not typically sleep naked, at least not in winter. Most people would wear a nightshirt or nightgown, a loose garment made from linen or sometimes wool. This garment was usually long, reaching to the knees or ankles, and had long sleeves. The purpose was to add another layer of insulation around the body. Some people might also wear a nightcap, a cloth cap that covered the head and helped retain body heat. Since significant heat loss occurs through the head, a nightcap was an effective way to stay warmer. In the coldest weather, people might go to bed wearing even more clothing. They might keep on their wool hose, essentially thick stockings that covered the legs and feet. They might wear additional undergarments. Some people slept in most of their day clothes, removing only their outer layers. The goal was to use every available means to trap body heat and prevent cold from reaching the skin. Bed socks or foot wraps were also used. Feet tend to get cold easily, and cold feet can make sleep difficult. Wrapping the feet in wool fabric or wearing thick wool socks helped keep them warm. Some people would place their feet against a hot stone or brick that had been heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth, as we discussed in the heating section. This combination of warm socks and an external heat source could keep feet comfortable for much of the night. Sharing a bed was the norm rather than the exception. Peasant families would typically sleep together, with parents and young children all in one bed. Older children might sleep in a separate bed in the same room, or they might sleep on straw on the floor near the main bed. The key principle was to share body heat. Two people sleeping together will each benefit from the other's warmth. 3 or 4 people in a bed generate even more heat, warming the air within the bed curtains more effectively. This practice wasn't limited to peasant households. Even in wealthy homes, married couples slept together, and children might share beds with siblings or servants. In castles, servants often slept on trundle beds or on simple pallets on the floor of their master's chamber, ready to attend to needs during the night, but also benefiting from the warmth of the fire in the chamber. Guests might share beds with hosts if space was limited. Privacy, as we understand it, was not a medieval concept. Communal sleeping was normal and unremarkable. The custom of sharing beds extended to travelers as well. Inns typically had large beds where multiple unrelated guests might sleep together, sometimes 4 or 6 to a bed. This practice seems strange to modern people, but it was driven by both practicality and economics. Beds were expensive, so inns minimized the number needed by having large beds, and shared sleeping was warmer, an important consideration in unheated or minimally heated inn chambers. The preparation of the bed each day was an important task. In the morning, bedding would be shaken out and aired if weather permitted. This helped reduce moisture buildup from breathing and perspiration overnight. Mattresses might be turned or rotated. Straw and straw mattresses would be redistributed to even out compressed areas. In wealthy households, servants would remake beds daily, ensuring everything was clean, smooth, and ready for the night. In peasant households, maintaining the bed fell to the women of the family, and standards varied depending on time and resources. Keeping bedding clean was challenging. Washing large pieces of fabric was labor-intensive, requiring heating substantial quantities of water, scrubbing the fabric, rinsing it, and drying it. This couldn't be done frequently, especially in winter when drying was slow. Instead, regular airing was the primary maintenance method. In summer, bedding might be washed a few times. In winter, it might not be washed at all, just aired and beaten to remove dust and debris. This meant that by late winter, bedding could be quite dirty and smelly by modern standards, but this was simply accepted as normal. Bed hangings in wealthy households would be taken down periodically for cleaning, typically in summer when they could be properly dried. This was a major undertaking, involving removing heavy curtains, cleaning them, and then rehanging them. It wasn't done often, perhaps once a year or even less frequently. The rest of the time, the curtains simply accumulated dust and smoke residue. Despite the challenges, medieval people understood the importance of their bedding. A good mattress, sufficient blankets, and effective curtains made the difference between a miserable night and a tolerable one. Families would invest in bedding to the extent they could afford to, recognizing that good sleep was essential for health and the ability to work. Bedding might be passed down through generations, carefully maintained and repaired. Wool blankets might be woven at home from wool produced by the family's own sheep, creating bedding that represented hours of labor spread over months. The bed was also a status symbol. The quality and quantity of bedding indicated wealth and social standing. A bed with fine linen sheets, multiple wool blankets, a fur coverlet, and elaborate curtains announced that its owner was prosperous. Wills from the medieval period often list bedding as among the most valuable possessions, bequeathed to heirs with the same care as land or livestock. This wasn't just about material value. It reflected the importance of the bed in daily life and in the struggle to survive winter. Daily winter routines and survival strategies. Getting through a medieval winter required more than just a warm bed and a functioning fire. It required an entire routine of practices, habits, and strategies that started when people woke in the morning and continued until they climbed back into bed at night. Understanding these daily routines helps us see how people actually lived through the coldest months and managed to not just survive but maintain relatively normal lives. The day began early, even in winter, though not as early as in summer when agricultural work demanded attention at dawn. In winter, with less outdoor work to be done, people might sleep a bit later, but they still needed to rise while there was daylight to work by. Waking up in a medieval winter bedroom was an abrupt transition from whatever warmth had been achieved under the blankets to the cold reality of the room. The first task was restarting the fire. As we discussed, the fire would have been carefully banked overnight, with coals buried under ash to keep them alive but burning very slowly. Someone, typically a servant in a wealthy household or one of the adults in a peasant family, would get up and go to the hearth. They would carefully rake away the ash, exposing the still glowing coals. Using bellows, they would blow gently on these coals, adding small twigs or dry kindling as the coals brightened. Once flames appeared, they would gradually add larger pieces of wood, building the fire back up to a good working heat. This process took time and skill. If done wrong, the coals might go out completely, forcing someone to go to a neighbor to borrow fire, an embarrassing admission of poor fire management. If done right, within 15 or 20 minutes, a good fire would be burning, beginning to warm the room and providing heat for cooking breakfast. During this time, other household members would be stirring, but most would stay under their covers as long as possible, waiting for the room to warm at least slightly before facing the cold. Dressing in winter was an exercise in layering. Everyone, regardless of social class, wore multiple layers of clothing to trap air and provide insulation. For a peasant man, the innermost layer would typically be a linen shirt, worn next to the skin. Despite the cold, linen was preferred because it could be washed more easily than wool, helping reduce itching and skin irritation from the outer wool garments. Over the shirt would go a wool tunic, perhaps knee-length or longer. Wool hose would cover the legs, essentially thick wool stockings that reached from feet to upper thighs and were tied to the tunic with laces. Over all this might go an outer tunic or coat, often made from heavier wool, possibly lined with additional fabric for warmth. Women wore similar layers, a linen shift or chemise, then a wool kirtle or gown, possibly with an additional overgown in cold weather. Both men and women would wear head coverings. Men might wear a wool cap or hood. Women would wear a coif or wimple fabric head coverings that served both modesty requirements and practical warmth purposes. Everyone would wrap cloaks or mantles around themselves when going outside, these being large rectangles of wool cloth that could be draped and fastened to provide protection against wind and cold. Footwear was another challenge. Peasants often wore simple leather shoes or wooden clogs. These provided some protection but were not waterproof or especially warm. In wet or snowy conditions, feet would often get cold and damp. Some people stuffed their shoes with straw or wool to provide additional insulation. Wealthier people had better quality leather boots or shoes, sometimes lined with fabric or fur, but even these weren't as effective as modern insulated boots. Keeping feet warm and dry was a constant struggle in winter. Once dressed and once the fire was properly burning, the focus shifted to breakfast. Medieval breakfast was typically a simple meal, especially in winter when food supplies might be limited. Peasants might eat bread, perhaps dipped in ale or milk if available. They might have some cold pottage left from the previous day. Occasionally, there might be cheese or a bit of bacon. The meal wasn't elaborate, but it provided necessary energy for the day's work. The important thing was to eat something warm if possible, as this helped raise body temperature and prepare for going out into the cold. Wealthier households had more varied breakfasts, but even these were simpler than main meals. Bread with butter, perhaps some cold meat, ale or wine, maybe some fruit preserved from autumn or imported dried fruit if the household was quite wealthy. The focus was on getting sustenance rather than on culinary pleasure. After breakfast, the day's work began. For peasants during winter, the work was different from the intense agricultural labor of summer. Fields were dormant and there was no planting or harvesting to be done. But winter had its own labor demands. Animals still needed care. Cows, if the family had them, needed to be milked and fed. Sheep needed to be checked and fed. Chickens and other fowl needed tending. Pigs needed feeding. Horses or oxen needed care. In many peasant households, animals might be brought into the living space in the coldest weather, providing both warmth from their bodies and protection for them from the elements. Firewood needed to be brought in from storage. If the household was reliant on gathering wood rather than purchasing it, winter days with decent weather would be spent cutting and hauling wood. This was hard physical labor, and ironically, it helped keep people warm through the activity itself. Swinging an axe, carrying heavy logs, stacking wood, these activities generated body heat and kept blood flowing. Many peasants found that they felt warmer while working than while sitting idle, despite being outside in cold weather. Repairs and maintenance occupied much winter time. Tools needed fixing. Fences needed mending before spring. Thatched roofs needed patching if leaks had developed. Women would spin wool, weave fabric, mend clothing, and prepare materials for the year ahead. These tasks could be done indoors near the fire, making them suitable for the coldest days. The household would often work communally in the main room. Everyone gathered near the warmth while working on their individual tasks. Food preparation was a significant daily task. Even simple meals required work. Water needed to be fetched, often from a well or stream, and in freezing weather this could mean breaking ice. Grains needed to be ground into flour, typically by hand using a quern stone. Vegetables needed to be prepared. In winter, fresh vegetables were rare, so meals relied on stored root vegetables like turnips, onions, and carrots, along with dried beans and peas. Meat was a luxury for most peasants. but when it was available, it needed to be cooked, often in the same pot where vegetables simmered, creating a stew or pottage that could feed the family for days. The midday meal was the main meal for most medieval people. This would be eaten around noon, after several hours of work. The meal would typically be whatever had been cooking over the fire, along with bread and perhaps ale or water. Everyone would gather together, warming themselves by the fire while they ate. This communal meal was an important time for family interaction and for warming up after morning labors. After the midday meal, work would continue into the afternoon. In winter, daylight ended early, so people tried to accomplish whatever needed outdoor work during the limited daylight hours. As darkness approached, which in midwinter could be as early as 4 in the afternoon, people would move toward indoor activities. Animals would receive their evening feeding. The fire would be built up again for cooking the evening meal and for warmth during the evening hours. The evening meal was typically lighter than the midday meal, perhaps leftover pottage, more bread, and whatever else was available. After eating, the household would settle in for the evening. This was a time for socializing within the family, for telling stories, perhaps for simple entertainments. In a peasant household, people might continue small tasks by firelight, mending, spinning, sharpening tools. But mostly, the evening was a time to rest and stay warm before sleep. As bedtime approached, preparations would begin. The fire would be carefully banked for the night, as we've discussed. If the household had bed warmers or hot stones, these would be prepared. Children would be sent to bed first, often sharing beds or sleeping on straw near the main bed. Adults would follow, moving from the relative warmth of the fireside to the cold of the sleeping area. If the family had separate sleeping chambers, this meant leaving the main room and its fire for the unheated bedroom, a transition that required fortitude. Getting into bed was a quick process in winter. People would undress minimally, keeping on most or all of their underclothes. They would climb under the covers as quickly as possible, pulling blankets tight, and if the bed had curtains, closing those curtains to trap warmth. If hot stones or bed warmers had been used, these would already be in the bed, providing initial warmth. If multiple people were sharing the bed, they would arrange themselves to maximize shared warmth, often lying close together or even cuddling for heat. The first hour in bed could be uncomfortable despite all preparations. The bedding would be cold, and it took time for body heat to warm the space within the bed curtains. Cold feet and hands were common complaints. People would curl up, trying to make themselves small to conserve heat. Some would pull blankets over their heads, despite the reduced air quality, to keep their face warm. Gradually, as body heat accumulated in the enclosed space, and as the bedding itself warmed, comfort would improve. Within an hour or so, a properly prepared bed could become reasonably comfortable, if not exactly warm by modern standards. Sleep itself was different in medieval times, at least according to some historians. There's evidence suggesting that segmented sleep was common, where people would sleep for a few hours after dark, wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and then sleep again until dawn. During the wakeful period, people might talk, pray, tend the fire, eat a small meal, or engage in other quiet activities. This pattern may have been a natural response to long winter nights. With darkness lasting 14 or 15 hours, sleeping through the entire night without interruption might have been difficult. However, the evidence for segmented sleep is debated, and experiences likely varied. Some people probably did sleep in segments, while others slept continuously when they could. What's certain is that sleep was often interrupted by cold, by needs to use the chamber pot, by crying children, by various household noises. Medieval houses weren't quiet at night. Animals might make sounds. The wind might howl through gaps. The fire might pop and crack as coals shifted. Other family members might snore or move restlessly. Perfect, uninterrupted sleep was probably rare. Throughout the day and night, staying warm required constant attention and effort. People couldn't just set a thermostat and forget about temperature. They had to actively manage their warmth through clothing choices, proximity to fire, activity level, and clever use of whatever resources were available. This meant that winter was mentally exhausting as well as physically demanding. The constant need to think about staying warm to make adjustments to plan ahead took a toll. Despite these challenges, medieval people developed remarkable resilience. They adapted to conditions that would seem intolerable to most modern people. They found small pleasures in winter: the warmth of the fire, a hot meal, the comfort of family gathered together, the satisfaction of a well-managed household. They endured because they had no choice and because they didn't know any different way of living. For them, this was simply what winter was: a challenging time to be gotten through with whatever resources and ingenuity they could muster. Social class differences in winter comfort. While everyone in medieval England faced the challenge of winter cold, the experience varied dramatically depending on social class and economic resources. The strategies available to a noble family in a stone castle were vastly different from those available to a peasant family in a one-room cottage. And understanding these differences helps us appreciate the full range of medieval winter sleeping experiences. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the peasants and laborers who made up the vast majority of the population. These people lived in the simple timber and thatch structures we've described, often with just one room serving all purposes. Their mattresses were straw, their blankets few and likely worn. Many peasant households might have only 2 or 3 wool blankets total, which had to serve the entire family. In the coldest weather, the entire family would huddle together in one bed, sharing blankets and body heat. Children might sleep 3 or 4 to a bed, or sleep on straw on the floor near the main bed, wrapped in whatever spare fabric was available. The fire in a peasant home would burn as much as fuel supplies allowed, but for many families, fuel was limited. If they had to purchase wood, the cost was significant relative to their income. If they gathered it themselves, the time and labor involved were substantial. This meant that fires might be smaller than desired, might be allowed to go out during the day when everyone was working, and might be banked early in the evening to conserve fuel. The result was that peasant homes were cold most of the time, with only brief periods of real warmth immediately around the fire. Clothing for peasants was minimal and made from the coarsest materials. Wool garments might be worn for years, becoming threadbare and developing holes. Replacement clothing was expensive, so every effort would be made to repair and maintain what existed. Some peasants might have only one set of clothes, worn constantly and washed only occasionally. Others might have a work set and a slightly better set for church or special occasions. The constant wearing of wool against skin, especially unwashed wool, caused itching and skin irritation that people simply learned to tolerate. Food in peasant households during winter was monotonous and often inadequate. Stores laid in during autumn had to last until spring, and miscalculation or bad luck could mean running short before new food became available. The cold itself increased caloric needs, as the body burned more energy to maintain temperature, but food availability didn't increase to match. This meant that many peasants were perpetually hungry during winter, which further decreased their ability to stay warm. A malnourished body can't generate heat as effectively as a well-fed one, creating a dangerous cycle. The health impacts of this lifestyle were significant. Peasants suffered from respiratory diseases, probably exacerbated by smoky indoor environments and cold, damp conditions. Joint problems and arthritis were common, worsened by constant cold and damp. Skin conditions, including various infections and infestations, were widespread. Life expectancy for peasants was lower than for wealthier classes, and the winter months were particularly dangerous. Deaths from cold, hunger, and disease peaked during winter. Moving up the social scale, prosperous farmers and craftspeople had somewhat better conditions. These might be people who owned their land rather than working as tenants, or skilled craftspeople like blacksmiths, millers, or weavers. Their houses might have 2 or 3 rooms, including a separate sleeping chamber. They might have wooden bed frames with rope supports, and their mattresses might be better quality, perhaps with some wool or feathers mixed with straw. They might have 4 or 5 blankets, and possibly one nicer coverlet kept for special occasions but used in the coldest weather. These households could afford more fuel, so their fires could burn more consistently. They might have glazed windows in 1 or 2 rooms, providing light while blocking drafts better than wooden shutters. Their clothing would be of better quality wool, replaced more frequently. Their winter food supplies would be more varied and more adequate. They weren't living in luxury, but they weren't living on the edge of survival either. Winter was uncomfortable but manageable. For the emerging middle class of successful merchants and lower nobility, winter conditions improved further. Their houses might be substantial timber-framed structures with multiple rooms, including dedicated bedrooms. These homes might have fireplaces with chimneys rather than just central hearths, allowing for fires in multiple rooms. Bedrooms might have their own fireplaces, kept burning at least in the evening to warm the room before bed. The beds in these households would have proper wooden frames and might feature the enclosing curtains we discussed earlier. Mattresses would be filled with feathers or wool, providing genuine comfort and warmth. Multiple blankets made from good quality wool would be available, along with heavier coverlets and possibly fur throws. Linen sheets would separate sleepers from the mattress and from the wool blankets, reducing itching and providing a cleaner sleeping surface. These households could afford to heat their homes more generously. Multiple fires might burn simultaneously during the coldest weather. Servants would be employed to manage the fires, carry fuel, prepare beds, and handle various household tasks. Braziers might be used to provide additional heat in specific rooms. Hot stones and bed warmers would be routinely used to prepare beds before sleeping. The experience of winter for this class was still uncomfortable by modern standards, but it was tolerable rather than harsh. Food for the middle class would be abundant and varied. Stored meats, including salted pork and smoked ham, would supplement the grain-based diet. Imported spices might make food more palatable. Wine or better quality ale would be available. The household would have sufficient calories to maintain body warmth, and indeed, concerns about weight and overeating appear in documents from this class, suggesting that food scarcity wasn't a primary concern. At the top of the social hierarchy, the nobility and royalty experienced winter very differently. Their castles and manor houses, while still cold by modern standards, had resources available that made winter far more bearable. Multiple fireplaces throughout the residence could be kept burning continuously. Servants would ensure fires never went out and that fuel was always available. Some nobles had winter and summer residences, and they might move to smaller, more easily heated properties during the coldest months. The private chambers of nobles were made as comfortable as possible. Heavy tapestries covered stone walls, providing insulation and decoration. Wooden paneling created additional barriers against cold. Beds were large, elaborate pieces of furniture with thick curtains made from expensive fabrics. Multiple feather mattresses might be stacked on a single bed, creating a soft, warm sleeping surface elevated several feet off the ground. The bedding would include numerous wool blankets, fur coverlets, and silk or fine linen sheets and pillowcases. Night clothes for nobles would be made from fine linen or even silk. Nightcaps might be lined with fur. Some nobles wore gloves to bed to keep their hands warm. Hot stones and elaborate brass bed warmers would be used religiously. Servants might be assigned specifically to bed preparation, ensuring that noble family members climbed into warm, comfortable beds each night. The diet of nobles during winter was varied and abundant. Meat was eaten regularly, often daily. Game from hunting provided fresh meat even in winter. Preserved meats of all kinds, including exotic items like peacock or swan, might appear on noble tables. Imported foods including dates, figs, almonds, and spices were available. Wine was consumed freely. The caloric intake was more than sufficient to maintain body heat. Nobles also had the luxury of adjusting their activity levels to suit the weather. On the coldest days, they might simply stay indoors, entertaining themselves with games, music, reading, or socializing. They didn't have to go out into the elements to perform labor. This meant they could stay near fires, wrapped in furs and heavy robes, remaining comfortable without having to brave the cold. Even among nobles, there were gradations. A minor noble with a small manor might live comfortably but not luxuriously. A great lord with vast estates and hundreds of servants experienced winter very differently, and the royal family had resources that surpassed everyone else. Royal residences had the finest furnishings, the most servants, the best food, and every possible amenity. But even kings and queens were not completely immune to cold. Even in palaces, drafts existed. Even with massive fires, large stone halls remained chilly. Even the wealthiest people would layer clothing and pile on furs when winter cold was particularly intense. One notable difference across classes was in travel during winter. Peasants generally didn't travel during winter. Peasants generally didn't travel much at any time of year, but winter made travel especially difficult and dangerous. Roads became muddy or icy. Bridges could be washed out. Travel was slow, uncomfortable, and risky. For nobles, winter travel was also challenging, but they had resources that made it more feasible. They could travel with large retinues that provided protection and support. They could afford to stay at better inns or arrange lodging with other nobles. Their horses were better quality and better fed, and if conditions became truly terrible, they could simply stop and wait for better weather without facing starvation. This difference in mobility meant that nobles could escape particularly bad weather if necessary. If one region was experiencing an especially harsh winter, a noble family might relocate temporarily to a warmer region or to a better sheltered property. Peasants had no such option. They were bound to their land and their village, and they had to endure whatever conditions winter brought. The psychological impact of these class differences was significant. Nobles knew that while winter was uncomfortable, they would survive it. They had adequate food, adequate fuel, adequate shelter. They might be cold, but they wouldn't freeze. They might be bored, but they wouldn't starve. For peasants, winter brought real existential dread. Would the food last? Would the fuel last? Would everyone survive until spring? These were not abstract questions. They were life and death matters that occupied the mind constantly during the coldest months. Yet despite these vast differences in comfort and security, certain aspects of winter affected everyone. The cold itself was inescapable for all but the very wealthiest. The darkness was universal. The isolation of winter, when travel was difficult and social contact more limited, affected rich and poor alike. And the relief when spring finally arrived was felt by everyone, regardless of their station. Winter was a great leveler in some ways. even if it fell much harder on some than on others. The medieval social structure meant that improvement was nearly impossible for most people. A peasant family couldn't simply work harder and earn their way to better housing or more resources. Their position was largely fixed by birth and by the obligations they owed to their lord. This meant that winter suffering was often generational. The same families endured the same cold, the same hunger, the same fear, year after year, generation after generation, with little hope of change. For those further up the social ladder, improvement was more possible but still limited. A successful merchant might accumulate enough wealth to afford better housing and more fuel. A craftsperson might develop a reputation that allowed them to charge more for their work. But social mobility was slow and uncertain, and winter remained a challenge even for those who had achieved some measure of prosperity. Looking at these class differences helps us understand the full scope of medieval winter experience. We can see that while everyone faced the cold, the nature of that challenge varied enormously. For some, winter was an inconvenience and discomfort. For others, it was a genuine threat to survival. Understanding this range of experience gives us a more complete picture of what it meant to sleep through a medieval winter. Health, mortality, and medical understanding. Winter in medieval England wasn't just uncomfortable. It was genuinely dangerous, particularly for the very young, the very old, and those already weakened by poor nutrition or existing illness. Understanding the health impacts of medieval winters and how people try to cope with them using the medical knowledge available at the time gives us insight into just how challenging this season was. The first and most obvious health risk of winter was direct exposure to cold. Hypothermia, the condition where body temperature drops dangerously low, was a real threat. Medieval people didn't have a scientific understanding of hypothermia, but they certainly understood that extreme cold could kill. They knew that people who stayed out too long in severe cold might become confused, weak, and eventually lose consciousness. They knew that travelers caught in snowstorms might be found frozen to death. And they knew that the elderly and infants were particularly vulnerable to cold. To combat this, people took precautions that seem obvious to us but were based on practical experience rather than scientific understanding. They avoided going out in the worst weather unless absolutely necessary. When they did go out, they dressed as warmly as possible. They tried never to let fires go out completely, understanding that starting from scratch was not only difficult but could be dangerous if someone was already very cold. And they watched vulnerable family members carefully, keeping infants close to adult bodies for warmth, and ensuring that elderly relatives stayed near the fire. Frostbite was another cold-related condition that medieval people would have encountered regularly, though they wouldn't have called it by that name. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses could be damaged by extreme cold, especially when combined with dampness. The tissue would become numb and pale, and in severe cases, it would blacken and die. Medieval medical texts do mention treatments for cold-damaged extremities, typically involving gradual warming and the application of various ointments. Though without modern understanding of circulation and tissue damage, these treatments were of limited effectiveness. More insidious than direct cold injury were the respiratory illnesses that plagued medieval winters. The combination of cold, damp air outside and smoky, poorly ventilated air inside created conditions perfect for respiratory disease. Coughs, colds, and what was probably influenza were common winter ailments. Medieval people called these illnesses by various names and understood them through the lens of humoral theory, but the symptoms they described are recognizable to us: fever, coughing, difficulty breathing, body aches, and weakness. Respiratory infections could progress to more serious conditions. Pneumonia was a major killer in medieval times, particularly among the elderly and young children. The combination of cold, poor nutrition, and smoky living conditions made people vulnerable to lung infections that their bodies couldn't fight off effectively. Without antibiotics, many pneumonia cases were fatal. Medieval physicians would try various treatments including bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies, but their success rate was limited. Bronchitis and other chronic respiratory conditions were also widespread. The constant exposure to smoke from fires, combined with cold, damp air, took a toll on lungs over time. Many medieval people probably suffered from what we would now recognize as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or similar conditions. Their breathing would become progressively more labored, especially in cold weather, and they would cough persistently. While these conditions weren't immediately fatal, they reduced quality of life and made sufferers more vulnerable to acute infections. Tuberculosis, which medieval people called consumption, was a major health problem throughout the medieval period, and winter conditions likely made it worse. The disease spreads more easily in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, exactly the conditions that existed in medieval homes during winter when families huddled together indoors. The bacteria that causes tuberculosis thrives in conditions of poor nutrition and weakened immune systems, both of which were common in medieval winters. While tuberculosis wasn't seasonal in the way influenza is, winter conditions likely facilitated its spread and worsened outcomes for those already infected. Recent research examining disease burden in medieval England has shown that infant and child mortality from various causes had the greatest overall impact on population health, with tuberculosis being among the most significant chronic conditions. While dramatic events like plague outbreaks received more attention historically, the cumulative impact of chronic endemic diseases like tuberculosis actually caused more total suffering and death across the medieval period. Joint problems and arthritis were exacerbated by cold, damp conditions. Medieval people, especially those who labored outdoors or in cold environments, suffered from painful, swollen joints that became worse in winter. Without effective pain relief beyond rudimentary herbal remedies and warm compresses, people simply had to endure. The pain made movement difficult, which created a vicious cycle as reduced activity led to stiffness and further pain. For elderly people, severe arthritis could become debilitating, making them dependent on others for basic care. Chilblains, a painful inflammatory condition affecting the extremities, was probably very common in medieval winters. This condition occurs when skin is exposed to cold and then rewarms too quickly, causing blood vessels to become inflamed. The affected areas become red, swollen, and intensely itchy or painful. Medieval people probably experienced this regularly on their hands and feet, though they would have had no effective treatment beyond keeping the affected areas warm and dry. Malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies were serious winter health problems. As winter progressed and stored food supplies dwindled, many people's diets became increasingly restricted. Fresh fruits and vegetables were unavailable, leading to vitamin C deficiency. While full-blown scurvy was probably relatively rare except in the worst situations, subclinical vitamin deficiency would have been widespread. This would manifest as fatigue, poor wound healing, and increased susceptibility to infection, all of which made people more vulnerable to other winter health threats. Vitamin D deficiency was another issue, though medieval people had no concept of vitamins. During winter months, with limited sunlight and people spending most of their time indoors, vitamin D levels would drop. This would contribute to bone problems, weakened immune function, and general ill health. Children were particularly vulnerable, potentially developing rickets, a condition that causes soft, weak bones. While medieval people wouldn't have connected these problems to lack of sunlight, they might have noticed that people seemed generally less healthy during the dark winter months. Mental health was also affected by winter conditions, though medieval people understood this very differently than we do. The long, dark nights, the confinement indoors, the constant cold and discomfort, and the anxiety about survival all took a psychological toll. What we might now recognize as seasonal affective disorder or depression was probably common. Medieval medical theory might have attributed such symptoms to an imbalance of humors, perhaps an excess of black bile causing melancholy. Treatments might include dietary changes, herbal remedies, bloodletting, or religious practices like prayer and confession. The concept of humoral theory dominated medieval medical understanding and shaped how people thought about winter health. According to this theory, the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on these humors being in balance, and different seasons affected this balance. Winter was associated with phlegm, which was considered cold and moist. This aligned with observable reality, since winter conditions seemed to produce phlegmatic illnesses characterized by mucus, coughs, and colds. Medieval physicians believed that winter's cold and damp qualities penetrated the body and increased phlegm, causing respiratory illnesses and other problems. Their treatments aimed to counteract these qualities. They might recommend warm, dry foods like roasted meats and spiced wines. They might prescribe heating herbs like ginger, pepper, or mustard. They might advise patients to stay in warm environments and avoid cold, damp air. While these recommendations were based on incorrect theory, some of them were actually helpful in practical terms. Staying warm, eating nourishing food, and avoiding exposure to extreme cold did help people stay healthier. Bloodletting was a common treatment for many winter ailments, though medical authorities sometimes cautioned against it in very cold weather. The theory was that letting blood would remove excess or corrupted humors and restore balance. While we now know this was generally ineffective and often harmful, it remained a standard practice throughout the medieval period. A person suffering from a winter illness might visit a barber surgeon who would open a vein and drain a certain amount of blood, which was thought to provide relief. Herbal remedies were widely used for winter ailments. Medieval people had extensive knowledge of local plants and their medicinal properties, knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries. For coughs and respiratory problems, they might use herbs like elecampane, coltsfoot, or horehound. For fever, they might use feverfew or willow bark, the latter actually containing salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin. For joint pain, they might apply poultices made from warming herbs or animal fats. Some of these remedies had genuine therapeutic value, while others were simply part of a healing ritual that provided psychological comfort if nothing else. Monasteries and convents often served as centers of medical knowledge and care. Monks and nuns maintained herb gardens and prepared medicines. They cared for sick members of their communities and sometimes provided medical care to nearby villages. Monastic infirmaries were among the few places where sick people might receive something approaching organized medical care. These institutions also preserved and copied medical texts, maintaining knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. During winter, when illness was more common, monastic medical facilities would have been busy with respiratory ailments, cold injuries, and malnutrition-related problems. For most people, medical care meant home remedies and the knowledge passed down through families, particularly through women who served as caregivers. Mothers and grandmothers knew how to prepare poultices, make herbal teas, and provide nursing care. They knew the signs of serious illness and when to seek help from someone with more specialized knowledge. This informal medical system was the first line of defense against winter illness for the vast majority of medieval people. Preventive measures were based on keeping the body in proper balance and avoiding harmful influences. Medieval medical advice for winter would include staying warm, eating appropriate foods, getting adequate rest, and maintaining spiritual health through prayer. The connection between spiritual and physical health was taken for granted. Illness might be seen as divine punishment for sin, as a test of faith, or simply as part of the natural order that required acceptance and proper treatment. Churches played a role in both the spiritual and practical aspects of dealing with winter illness. People prayed for healing and made offerings to saints known for curing particular ailments. Saint Blaise was invoked for throat ailments, particularly appropriate for the respiratory diseases common in winter. The ritual of blessing throats on Saint Blaise's feast day, still practiced in some Christian traditions, dates back to the medieval period. These religious practices provided comfort and hope, even when physical treatments were ineffective. Mortality rates rose significantly in winter, particularly among vulnerable populations. Infants, who were already at high risk with perhaps a third to half dying before their first birthday, faced additional dangers in winter. The cold, the increased prevalence of respiratory infections, and the stress on already limited maternal nutrition all took their toll. Elderly people, especially those weakened by years of hard labor and poor nutrition, often didn't survive winter. The frail would fade as the cold season progressed, succumbing to pneumonia, to the complications of chronic conditions worsened by cold, or simply to general debility. Famine could make winter mortality much worse. If harvests failed in the preceding autumn, or if stores ran out before spring arrived, people would begin to starve. Starvation weakened the body's ability to fight off disease and to maintain body temperature. During famine years, winter mortality could spike dramatically. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which occurred during a period of climate deterioration, killed an estimated 10 to 25% of the population in some areas, with deaths concentrated during the coldest months. The transition from late winter to early spring could be particularly dangerous. This was when food stores were most depleted, when people were most weakened by months of poor nutrition and cold, and when they were most vulnerable to disease. If illness struck in late winter, bodies weakened by months of hardship had less ability to recover. Many deaths that occurred in March or April were the culmination of challenges that had accumulated throughout the winter. Medieval people understood that winter was dangerous. They knew that some family members, particularly the very young and very old, might not survive until spring. This knowledge shaped their attitudes and behaviors. They prepared as well as they could. They cared for their sick using whatever remedies and knowledge they possessed, and they accepted death as a natural part of life, even as they grieved for those they lost. The health challenges of medieval winters remind us that survival was never guaranteed. Every winter was a test, and while most people passed that test, many did not. The combination of cold, disease, and malnutrition created conditions where death was always possible. Understanding these health risks helps us appreciate the courage and resilience of medieval people who faced winter knowing its dangers, but without the medical knowledge or resources that might have made it safer. Modern research has revealed that the overall disease burden in medieval England was dominated by conditions that affected daily life chronically rather than by the dramatic epidemics that captured historical attention. Infant mortality, tuberculosis, Respiratory diseases, joint problems, and malnutrition-related conditions collectively caused more suffering and death than plague, despite plague's higher profile. Winter exacerbated all of these conditions, making it the season when the underlying fragility of medieval life became most apparent. The medical understanding available to medieval people was limited by the knowledge of their time, but it represented genuine attempts to comprehend and address health problems. Humoral theory, while incorrect, provided a framework for thinking about illness and health. Herbal remedies, while of variable effectiveness, represented accumulated practical knowledge. The care provided by family members, religious institutions, and practitioners represented human compassion in the face of suffering. These efforts may seem primitive to us, but they were what people had, and they did provide some comfort and occasionally some genuine help. As we reflect on medieval winter health, we're reminded of how vulnerable human beings are to their environment and how much modern medicine and public health have done to protect us from seasonal mortality. The simple fact that winter is no longer a particularly dangerous season for most people in developed countries represents an enormous achievement. Medieval people facing winter had no such protections, and understanding their experience helps us appreciate what they endured and what we now have. Cultural practices, beliefs, and community support. Medieval people didn't face winter in isolation. They were embedded in communities and cultural traditions that provided structure, meaning, and practical support during the coldest months. Understanding the cultural and social dimensions of medieval winter helps us see how people not only survived physically, but also maintained their spirits and their social bonds through this challenging time. The agricultural calendar structured medieval life, and winter represented a dramatic shift in the rhythm of daily existence. After the intense labor of planting, growing, and harvesting that occupied spring, summer, and autumn, winter brought a relative pause. The fields were dormant. There was still work to be done, caring for animals, maintaining buildings and tools, processing stored foods, but the crushing pace of agricultural labor eased. For many peasants and farmers, winter was actually a time when they had more leisure, even though it was also a time of cold and scarcity. This seasonal rhythm created a cultural pattern where winter became associated with indoor activities, with storytelling and socializing, with religious observance, and with community gathering. The long dark evenings couldn't be spent outdoors, so people gathered together. Families would sit around the fire in the evenings, working on small tasks but also talking, telling stories, singing songs. This was when cultural traditions were passed down, when children learned the stories and songs of their community, when history and folklore were transmitted orally from one generation to the next. Village communities provided crucial support during winter. While we've discussed how wealthy individuals had resources that poor individuals lacked, within peasant communities, there was often a strong ethic of mutual aid. Neighbors helped each other. If one family's roof leaked, neighbors might help repair it before winter worsened. If someone's woodpile was inadequate, there might be sharing or assistance with gathering more. If a family faced starvation, others in the village might share what little they had, knowing that their own survival might someday depend on similar kindness. This mutual support wasn't purely altruistic. It was also practical and necessary. Medieval villages were small, often containing only a few dozen families. Everyone knew everyone else. Isolation was impossible, and everyone understood that their survival might depend on maintaining good relationships with neighbors. This created a culture where helping others was expected, and where refusing to help could have serious social consequences. Churches served as important community centers during winter. The church building was often the largest and most solid structure in a village, and it provided a gathering place that was slightly warmer and more comfortable than most homes. During harsh weather, churches might open their doors to those most in need, providing temporary shelter. Religious services brought the community together regularly, providing not just spiritual sustenance but social contact and a break from the isolation of individual homes. The medieval church calendar provided structure to winter and gave people things to anticipate. The period from late November through early January was particularly important, with multiple feast days and observances that broke up the monotony of winter. St. Andrew's Day on November 30th marked the beginning of Advent. St. Nicholas Day on December 6th was celebrated with gift-giving in some regions. The winter solstice on December 21st had been important since pre-Christian times and remained culturally significant. Christmas began on December 25th and extended for 12 full days, ending on January 6th with Epiphany or Twelfth Night. These weren't just religious observances. They were times for feasting, for celebration, for community gathering. Christmas in particular was a major festival that involved rest from labor, special foods, extra drink, games, music, and general merriment. Even the poorest peasants tried to have something special for Christmas. Lords were expected to provide feasts for their tenants. Families might slaughter an animal they'd been saving. Ale and beer, always important in medieval diet, flowed more freely. For a few days, the hardship of winter was set aside for celebration. The 12 days of Christmas were a time when normal social hierarchies loosened slightly. There were traditions of role reversal and misrule. A boy might be elected as a mock bishop and given temporary authority. Servants might feast while masters served them. People dressed in disguises and performed plays and songs. This temporary inversion of normal order served as a kind of safety valve, allowing people to express themselves in ways that weren't normally permitted, all within the controlled context of holiday tradition. Wassailing was one winter custom that brought communities together. Groups would go from house to house, singing songs and offering good wishes in exchange for food and drink. In rural areas, wassailing might also involve going to orchards to bless the trees, singing to them and pouring cider or ale on their roots to ensure a good harvest in the coming year. These customs mixed pre-Christian traditions with Christian practice, and they reinforced community bonds while also connecting people to the agricultural cycle that governed their lives. Martinmas, celebrated on November 11th, marked the traditional time for slaughtering livestock that wouldn't be kept through winter. This practical necessity was turned into a community event and feast day. St. Martin was the patron saint of beggars and vine growers, and his feast day became associated with abundance and sharing. The fresh meat from the slaughter would be prepared in various ways, some eaten immediately in feasts and some preserved for winter stores. Communities would come together for the work of slaughtering and butchering, and then celebrate with meals featuring the fresh meat. Storytelling traditions thrived in winter's long evenings. This was when communities would gather to hear tales that educated, entertained, and reinforced cultural values. Religious stories from the Bible and from the lives of saints provided moral instruction. Historical tales and legends connected people to their past. Folk tales featuring magical beings, brave heroes, and cunning tricksters offered entertainment, and often subtle lessons about dealing with power, injustice, and hardship. These stories weren't just diversions. They were how culture was maintained and transmitted. For those who could read, which was a small minority in medieval England, winter provided time for reading. Monasteries had libraries, and monks might spend winter days copying manuscripts or studying religious texts. Wealthy nobles might own books, perhaps including illuminated manuscripts, religious works, classical texts, or romances. Reading aloud was common, so one literate person could share texts with many others. Winter's long nights made these reading sessions possible and valuable. Music was another important part of winter culture. Songs served many purposes. Work songs coordinated labor, religious hymns enhanced worship, drinking songs accompanied celebrations, and love songs and ballads provided entertainment. Many medieval songs that we know today originated in this period, passed down through oral tradition until they were eventually written down. During winter gatherings, someone might play simple instruments like pipes, drums, or stringed instruments, and the community would sing together. Games and entertainments helped pass winter hours. Simple board games like chess and backgammon were played by those who could afford game pieces. Dice games were popular at all social levels, despite being frowned upon by religious authorities because of their association with gambling. Children played with simple toys or created their own entertainments. When weather permitted, outdoor games might include early forms of football, which was much rougher and less organized than modern versions. Ice skating on frozen rivers and ponds provided both practical transportation and recreation. For the educated classes, winter was a time for intellectual pursuits. The tradition of winter reading included texts like the Secretum Secretorum, which offered advice on seasonal health and behavior. Such texts recommended adjusting diet to the season, eating warmer and richer foods in winter. They advised on when bloodletting was appropriate, generally cautioning against it in the coldest weather. They offered guidance on maintaining health through proper balance of the humors. While based on theories we now know to be incorrect, these texts represented sophisticated attempts to understand seasonal health patterns. Religious devotion intensified during winter's hardships. People prayed for deliverance from cold and hunger, for protection from illness, for survival until spring. They made offerings to saints, attended religious services, and performed acts of penance. The church taught that suffering could be redemptive, that enduring hardship with faith and patience was pleasing to God. This religious framework gave meaning to suffering that might otherwise have seemed pointless, helping people maintain hope even in desperate circumstances. Community support extended to the truly destitute through practices of charity. The church taught that giving to the poor was a religious duty that benefited the giver's soul. Monasteries and churches often distributed food to the poor, particularly during winter. Wealthy individuals might give alms or provide feasts for the less fortunate. While these charitable practices didn't solve poverty or prevent all starvation, they did provide a social safety net that helped some of the most vulnerable survive winter. Midwife networks and women's support systems were crucial for dealing with winter childbirth. Women who gave birth during winter faced particular dangers, and experienced midwives would attend births, providing what assistance they could. Other women from the community would help with childcare and household tasks while a new mother recovered. This informal but essential support system operated primarily among women and was vital for maternal and infant survival. Village governance structures, such as they were, sometimes intervened to ensure winter survival. In manorial communities, the lord had some responsibility for his tenants' welfare, if only because dead tenants couldn't work the land. In cases of extreme hardship, lords might reduce rents or tithes temporarily, or provide grain from manorial stores. Village councils or assemblies might organize collective efforts to help struggling families. These weren't formalized welfare systems in any modern sense, but they represented recognition that community survival depended on helping the weakest members. The cultural expectation of hospitality was particularly important in winter. Travelers caught by bad weather needed shelter, and providing such shelter was considered a moral and social obligation. Inns provided accommodation for those who could pay, but private homes also took in travelers, at least in emergencies. Refusing shelter to someone in need during winter weather could literally condemn them to death, and such refusal would have been seen as shameful. This hospitality tradition helped bind communities together and created obligations of reciprocity that strengthened social bonds. Festivals of light had special significance during winter's darkness. Candles were expensive, but they took on ritual importance during winter celebrations. Churches would be filled with candles for special services. Households would light extra candles or rushlights for Christmas and other feast days. These lights had both practical and symbolic purpose. They dispelled some of the physical darkness while also symbolizing hope, divine presence, and the eventual return of longer days. Fire festivals and practices related to flame had roots in pre-Christian winter solstice observances and continued into the Christian era. The Yule log tradition involved bringing a large log into the house and keeping it burning throughout the 12 days of Christmas. This provided warmth, but it also carried symbolic meaning related to protection, prosperity, and continuity. Ashes from the Yule log might be saved and used for various purposes throughout the year, including as a supposed protection for the home. Communal meals during winter celebrations were more than just eating together. They represented shared abundance, temporary escape from scarcity, and reaffirmation of community bonds. Even the poor would try to have something special to share. The act of eating together, of sharing what was available, created a sense of common purpose and mutual obligation that helped communities survive not just winter, but the year round. Whether lore and folk predictions gave people a sense of control over unpredictable conditions. Communities developed sayings and observations about weather patterns. If certain conditions appeared, certain weather would follow. These predictions were based on generations of observation, and while not scientifically accurate, they sometimes contained useful patterns. More importantly, they gave people a framework for thinking about and preparing for winter weather. Being able to predict, even imperfectly, when the worst cold would come or how long winter would last provided psychological comfort. The tradition of passing winter survival knowledge from generation to generation ensured that essential skills weren't lost. Parents taught children how to recognize when enough firewood had been gathered, how to preserve foods properly, how to layer clothing effectively, how to read weather signs, how to care for animals in cold weather. This educational process was informal but crucial, happening through daily example and instruction rather than through formal schooling. Community memory preserved knowledge of past winters, particularly unusually severe ones. Stories would be told of the winter when the Thames froze, or when snow was so deep that travel became impossible, or when food ran out before spring and people starved. These stories served as warnings, reminding communities to prepare adequately and not to assume that winter would be mild. They also served as benchmarks, helping people assess whether a current winter was truly exceptional or merely normal hardship. The cultural practices and community supports that helped medieval people survive winter were developed over centuries of experience. They represented accumulated wisdom about how to maintain not just physical survival, but also social cohesion and mental health during months of darkness, cold, and confinement. These practices acknowledge that humans are social beings who need more than food and shelter. They need meaning, connection, entertainment, and hope. The rich cultural life that medieval communities maintained during winter provided these essential psychological and social needs. Looking at these cultural practices helps us understand that medieval people weren't simply enduring winter passively. They were actively creating structures of meaning and support that made winter bearable. They were maintaining traditions that connected them to their past and gave shape to their future. They were building and maintaining the social bonds that would help them survive not just this winter, but all the challenges their lives would bring. The community gatherings, the religious observances, the storytelling, the shared meals, all of these were as essential to winter survival as adequate food and fuel, because they sustained the human spirit through the darkest months. Conclusion and modern reflection. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval English winters, take a moment to appreciate where you are right now. Perhaps you're lying in a heated room, under synthetic blankets that provide warmth without weight, in a house that maintains a comfortable temperature regardless of the weather outside. Perhaps you're confident that you'll wake up tomorrow morning to running water, electricity, abundant food, and a warm shower. These aren't luxuries by our standards. They're normal. They're what we expect. But to a medieval person, they would seem like unimaginable miracles. The contrast between our world and the medieval world is nowhere more stark than in how we experience winter. We've explored the physical reality of medieval winter sleeping, the cold, drafty houses with their inadequate insulation, the single central hearth that provided warmth only in its immediate vicinity, the beds made from straw or feathers with whatever blankets could be accumulated, the need to share body heat with family members, the banking of fires overnight that left rooms growing steadily colder as the night progressed. We've seen how even the wealthy, with their stone castles and multiple fireplaces, couldn't escape the fundamental coldness of winter. But we've also seen the ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability that allowed medieval people not just to survive these conditions, but to maintain functioning societies. They developed construction techniques that, while primitive by modern standards, did provide shelter. They created bedding arrangements that maximized warmth through layering and shared body heat. They planned ahead, storing food and fuel months in advance. They supported each other through community networks and cultural practices. They found meaning and even joy in the midst of hardship through festivals, storytelling, and shared celebrations. The health challenges of medieval winters remind us of human vulnerability. Without modern medicine, winter illnesses that we now treat easily could be fatal. Without adequate nutrition, bodies weakened and became susceptible to disease and cold injury. Without understanding of how disease spreads or how to prevent infection, simple illnesses could become epidemics. The elevated winter mortality, particularly among infants and the elderly, was accepted as natural and inevitable. People knew they might lose loved